Hi YouTube, my name is Jack, and today we are going to talk a little bit more about the thoughts that I have surrounding bootstrapping a coven, being the only coven leader who's available in Utah, and the potential pitfalls of that process and the things that I'm trying to do in order to provide the best possible experience to my trainees. At this point, I have a number of seekers in my group. Some of them came and went, which always happens with groups, right? Not everyone who reaches out with you ends up deciding to stick around. Some of them have stuck around for quite a while, so the people who have been with me longest have been with me about 9 months at this point. And one of the things that I am very conscious of as I train these seekers and as I have conversations with them about Wicca, ritual, magic, paganism, and so on, is that I am the only source they have of credible seeming authority about Gardnerian Wicca. In a traditional environment, even if you have a brand new coven that's starting, even if you don't have an established coven of multiple initiates, you have at least the high priestess and the high priest of the coven present, who are each unique individuals with their own insights and their own perspectives on the tradition, and they can provide a little bit of a check to one another. Where if the high priestess says, I've always thought about things as X, Y, and Z, if the high priest has a different experience or a different perspective to offer on that, he can share his perspective, and then vice versa. And the result of that is that they kind of balance each other out, and they show potential initiates. They show seekers from very early on that there is a multiplicity of experiences possible within the tradition, and that there's a multiplicity of ways to do things that are legitimate. And if you have an established coven going, different covens do things differently, but oftentimes in an established coven, the seekers will have the opportunity to meet at least some of the members of that coven before being initiated. And those members of the coven may or may not out themselves as initiates, right? They may not reveal that they're initiated members of the coven. But again, there is often at least some kind of environment in which the seeker gets to meet people other than the coven leaders and share some kinds of experiences, get perspectives. And then once they're initiated, they have other people present in the coven, besides just the high priestess, besides just the high priest, who have been in the tradition for a while and have their own experiences and their own thoughts on things. And I think that's really healthy. Moreover, in locations that are sort of geographically concentrated with initiates, there is sometimes, depending on the culture of the particular place where you are, a certain amount of cross-pollination between covens, even prior to initiation. So in my own initiating coven, right, there were a couple of times where we had guests from another coven that came over and joined us for a training night. And they were the leaders of that other coven, but I had the opportunity to meet and interact with the leaders of that other coven and their training group, and hear their perspectives on things, interact with them, learn a little bit about how they trained, which was different from how I was being trained in some ways. I had the opportunity to interact with the leaders of other covens who were downline from my own high priestess, who in many ways were very similar in their approach to the craft to my high priestess, but who had their own spin on things and their own way of doing things. And all of that diversity is really, really healthy, because it shows seekers that as much as the leader of your coven or leaders of your coven know their shit, right? As much as they are familiar with the tradition and they have been practicing the tradition for a long time and they know what they're doing, there are other ways to do it. And that's not to say that new seekers are immediately going to be branching out and trying 50 different ways of doing things and all that. But I think it's really good for seekers to understand from very early on the plurality of the tradition, the multiplicity of perspectives, and the understanding that, hey, in this coven, we do things this way. That does not mean that everyone is going to do things this way. It does not mean that everyone should do things this way. And, I've said it before and I'll say it again, there are broad commonalities across Wicca. All of the people that I interacted with prior to initiation, there were certain things that were more or less held constant. Some variations may seem more drastic than others. Part of that is going to depend on regional differences or differences in lineage. Part of that is going to depend on the amount that an individual coven sort of branches off from how they were trained. So there are some people, right, who do ritual, hi sweetie, who do ritual more or less exactly the way that their initiating covens did. Totally legitimate. There are also people who, when they hive and start their own covens, kind of throw out the whole playbook and then rebuild from the ground up based on sort of the fundamental the bare bones of the way Wicca works. They start there and then they kind of build themselves up again from there, figuring out what's right for their coven and letting go of all of the coven-specific things from their initiated coven. That's also perfectly legitimate. There are multiple ways of doing it. And because of those variations, there will be places and times where you have lots of covens doing things very, very similarly. And there will be places and times where you have very noticeable and distinct divergences between covens. But all of that is to say that I think it's really good for seekers and then also for new initiates to have exposure to other people and to be presented with an awareness of what other people are doing. From pretty early on after initiation, I had exposure to a lot of the wider Gardnerian community, and I learned about people doing things differently in ways that I had not even realized it was possible to do differently within the tradition. And that was really good for me. There is a tendency, especially among some American initiates, to think about or to be in the flawed pursuit of the right way of doing things. There is sometimes this idea that there is a correct way of doing the Gardnerian tradition that floats out in the ether, and we all just need to figure out what the most traditional thing is, and that's what we should all be doing. And that doesn't exist. That has never existed. There's always been variation between covens. And again, there has also always been broad structural similarity in certain respects between covens, but there's always been a lot of variation. And there have always been things that were really, really important to one coven that were either non-existent or totally unimportant to other covens. So I think that having that exposure to other perspectives breaks you pretty early on of that idea that there is a right way to do things and that you should be in pursuit of that. And it lets you ease into, okay, we as a coven are trying to find our own connection to these mysteries using this framework that is broadly shared by other initiates and other covens. And we're going to find the particular ritual flourishes or embellishments or whatever that are going to work for us. And that's a very different question than what is the right way of doing it. Now, I think that's difficult given the situation that I'm in with my seekers here, because I'm the only one who's here. So let's talk a little bit about the things that I'm trying to do in order to get as much of that in the door as possible. For one thing, in training conversations, I will frequently try my best to present viewpoints other than my own. So just as an example, I really don't do a lot of magic with the 4 elements. It's totally legit. It's very much present in the broader Wiccan community. Largely, I think it's that I came out of an initiating coven that did a lot with the 4 elements, and there's a little bit of, like, everyone wants to be the opposite of their parent, right? Like, there's a little bit of rebellion going on there, where it's just like, that was a very heavy focus in the coven that I came up in, and as I have stepped away from that coven, my own practice has moved away from that as well. So I'm not doing a lot with the elements when I'm training my seekers, because it's not how I practice, it's not how I relate to the tradition. But even though we're not doing a lot with the elements, I have still tried to make a point to take a step back at various instances and say, okay, this is what I think, this is how I approach things, this is how I relate to things. And also, you will find some other people in the tradition who will say this, or who will do this. And I think it's really important to try as much as possible to flag those differences where they show up. Relatedly, I really make a point of trying to promote works by other Gardnerian initiates, including people who are from totally different lineages to me, whose practice looks totally different to my own. I have a recommended reading list for seekers, which is the same as the, I have a video about it, 8 recent books for Gardnerian seekers. I'll put that up here. But it's a list of 8 books, each of which is by a Gardnerian initiate who is out and public about the fact that they're an initiate. And each of those books is on a different topic, but they provide really different perspectives on witchcraft, religion, magic, and so on. And I think it's really good for people to have access to all of those perspectives, because a lot of them are very markedly different from my own. Now, right, that's not required reading. They're not being forced to read those books. But it's important to me that they know that resources like that are available and that they have access to them. Same thing with various, blogs and YouTube channels and podcasts and so on. It's important for people to have access to perspectives other than my own. And since I don't have other initiates live and in person here who can do those checks and balances for me, I have to try to make media available to my people that does that instead. Part of this is also that as much as I try to be honest and to fairly represent the ways that other people might interact with the tradition, no one knows their own blind spots. And there are points of divergence between me and other initiates that it wouldn't even occur to me to talk about, because I am aware of the things that I think about sort of the salient differences between my approach to the tradition and what someone else might say. But the nature of private minds is that I don't know what other people think about that. There are differences that I'm going to pick out that other people might not, and there are differences that other people would pick out that I might not. And so it is kind of a failed project from the outset, me trying to present not only my own perspective, but also everyone else's perspective as much as I can, because I don't know everyone else's perspective. And that's why I think it's really important for people to have access to other people in their own words as much as possible. And then the final really big thing that I'm doing, again, to try to curtail that as much as possible, is that I've had a handful of Gardnerian friends who have come to visit me in Salt Lake City. And where possible, I have introduced those people to my seekers. And when that happens, when we have sort of the overlap between someone's visit and a night that I'm meeting with the seekers, basically we do a Q&A night. And I tell the visiting initiate, right, you are welcome to talk to them about whatever you want to talk about within the confines of your oath as you interpret it, because different people interpret their oaths differently. There are things that other people are comfortable talking about that I am decidedly not comfortable talking about. There are things that I might be comfortable talking about that other people are decidedly not comfortable talking about. But like, I want people to have the authentic experience of interacting with those other people and getting perspectives that aren't mine. And part of that means, like, you have the conversation the way that you would have it. And we just kind of sit around and people have the opportunity to ask questions. And I think it's really good for them to get a little bit of that exposure. So, you know, I'm trying. It would be so easy to just teach people all the things that I think and all the ways that I like to practice and leave it at that. And in many cases, I think, right, like covens that do that, it's legit and it's above board. And that's kind of the way that covens work. Because why would you teach things that you don't agree with or don't practice? They're not going to be relevant to initiates in your coven. But I think because of the unique circumstances of this group, because we are so isolated from other Gardnerians, because I am the only initiate currently present, and so I'm the only one who has a perspective to offer, I feel like right now, at least, I really have an obligation and a duty to my people to try to present as fairly and fully as I can the range of perspectives that they might encounter. And, you know, like once there are initiates in the group and there are people who are able to speak for themselves about their experiences, that need will probably fade away a little bit. But right now, because I am kind of set up as the only authority on the tradition in the room, I just think it's really important for me to make other authorities accessible to people, so that I'm not accidentally creating the cult of Jack Chanek. So I will wrap this up here. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you sometime soon. Bye.